Oh, I'm excited about having this man with us right now. Ken Pomeroy, who we know as Ken Pom from his college basketball ratings, is joining us now live via Zoom. We appreciate Ken giving us a little time here on the show today. Welcome, Ken. Good to see you, and hope your summer's going well.
Yeah, it's going great, Steve. Nice to be able to chat with you, and nice to have some college hoops to talk about at this time of year.
I was excited when I heard the news about what the WAC was going to be doing with their WAC tournament. And there's a lot of reasons why. UTEP was a member of the WAC for many years. And as you probably remember, in the days of Utah, BYU, New Mexico, before the Mountain West, it was one of the best mid-major conferences in all of college basketball. And they've always been a conference that hasn't been afraid to try something different. So when we heard the news that they were going to take your ratings and incorporate that into their tournament seeding algorithm, I got pretty excited about that, Ken. I can't even imagine what you probably felt like when you heard the news.
It really is a great opportunity to work with the league. Brian Thornton, the commissioner, got to give him a lot of credit for really kind of thinking outside the box and being open to doing something like this. I think it's going to be an exciting thing for the WAC, and if nothing else, we got a lot of people talking about WAC college basketball in the middle of July, which has to be a first.
I love that. Exactly right. Now, for people that aren't familiar with your site and what you do, why don't you talk a little bit about kind of how you got involved in putting together your Ken Pom ratings years ago and how it's evolved over those years?
Yeah, it all started, early 2000s. Moneyball came out, the book, and there was, a lot of like analytics work going on in baseball. And I was not a huge baseball fan, but I was a huge college basketball fan. And I kind of wondered where all the analytics work was going on with that and didn't find a whole lot. So started my website and got rolling with that, and, kind of built it, without any expectation of ever being like this big or anything like that. I just built it like for myself, mostly as like kind of a reference for what teams did well and didn't do well, and rating all the teams from 1 to 300 and whatever. And it's just year by year grown a little bit, add little features, things like that. It's kind of a little more popular. Coaches started using it, media started mentioning it on the air, and things kind of took off to the point where they're at today.
When you grew up, what college basketball team were you rooting for?
I grew up on the East Coast, Northern Virginia. So I rooted for like the Virginia teams, Virginia Tech, VCU had a good team, but mostly it was Virginia and Virginia Tech that I rooted for growing up.
I find it interesting that you decided to put this whole thing together. Was it just that you weren't happy in those years with RPI and you felt that there were other ways you could measure the quality of a basketball team?
Yeah, that was it a little bit for sure. I was, just wanted like better analysis. You'd watch games on TV and like some people knew what they were talking about, but sometimes people would say things and I would be like, we have enough data now. We can really kind of like test if this is true or not. And so that's really what got me started. I mean, the thing that's, great about college basketball is that there are just so many different ways to have a successful program, different styles to win games. And I think, one of the things I really wanted to do with my site was like show that to people, like, hey, this team has this strength, this team has this strength. They play slow, they play fast, their defense is good, or, their offense is good. And this is why. That was really, the main motivation for me to get started.
How tough was it to kind of break through I guess maybe there was a block between kind of that old school mentality, thinking that there was a previous way of looking at basketball versus the advanced analytics version of basketball. How was it kind of breaking through those barriers right there with people?
Yeah, early on, it was definitely a little bit of a struggle. There's a lot of kind of like old school media who, you see this in every sport really, where people are using kind of more advanced statistics, but, they kind of push against the numbers and say, the game's not played with numbers or whatever. And, all I was trying to do is just put better information out there than we had. And some people, to their credit, took to it pretty quickly. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten to where I am without some media members and certainly coaches, embracing this stuff and mentioning it and getting the word out. And, that helped a great deal.
Ken Pomeroy with us here on Sports Talk as we continue. Would you say that your ratings favor mid-majors more than the traditional, what is now the net rankings through the NCAA, or is it pretty much in line with the other rankings out there?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, like the net's pretty similar to my ratings. You can find some differences. I'd like to think that like, my ratings aren't designed to like favor like one group or one conference or one style of team. They're designed to be fair to everybody. So, if you play in a league where, or especially if you play a schedule where, you don't have a lot of quality opponents, like, my system still should be able to like rank you accordingly based on how good your team is and how well you play. So that's the idea behind my system. So, you do see like strong teams from outside the Power Six conferences rise up the rankings. Like, people talk about how Gonzaga is always number one in my ratings, but, they've had really good teams the last few years. Like, I think Houston was like a team that was a great example last year, a team that, people didn't think much of because they didn't really have like quality wins during the regular season. But, based on their scoring differential and their strength of schedule, like even though it wasn't great, it was good. It was pretty clear they were a solid team heading into the NCAA tournament and a little bit underrated by the public.
Ken, it's funny. Matt Norlander did a really nice job when he wrote the story about the WAC and went into pretty good detail about your system and how that would affect the WAC from last year as a guide and then this year as well, and how the whole thing is going to go into place. I bring up New Mexico State because they have 1 year left in the WAC. And then they moved to Conference USA along with UTEP and 3 other schools that are going to be coming in. And yet, when we heard from Greg Heyer, the new head coach at NMSU, he was talking about how difficult it is right now for him to schedule games, that nobody wants to play them. And whether it's them going on the road or trying to bring teams in at home, they're really having a tough time right now getting games against anyone that's worth a salt, because they don't want to risk a possible loss. And you look into the way that impacts scheduling. How tough is it, you think, when you're a college basketball team like them, and you just came off a tournament win, and right now you're nobody even wants to play you when it comes down to it?
Yeah, it's a major issue in the sport, and I think it's something that probably doesn't get solved very easily. Like I know the WAC is trying to work on some sort of scheduling alliance with some other leagues and have kind of, resuscitate bracket busters a little bit, in like February or something like that. But yeah, it's a major issue. And I should point out, like, the system we devised for the standings here, like, people are talking about how, you need to schedule tough teams or whatever to do well in it. And that certainly helps. Like, it helped New Mexico State last year. We'd had this system last year, they beat good teams like Washington State and Davidson, and those would greatly help their situation. But you could still get away with scheduling teams in the 150 to 200 or even 250 range. If you win the vast majority of those games on your schedule, like, you're still going to fare pretty well in this approach. So this isn't totally about schedule strength. It's really mostly about just evaluating like how well you do against the schedule you played. You're obviously expected to win those games against lesser teams, but if you do that and you beat some mid-level teams, like, you're still going to rate pretty well in the system.
I want to talk about your system because there is opportunities for people to go and log in. They can subscribe to what you do. And when you do go in different schools, you will have advanced analysis of each team. And let's begin with 4 factors, because you've got those 4 factors: effective field goal percentage, turnover percentage, offensive rebound percentage, and then, free throw attempts and field goal attempts. How, when you came up with the 4 factors, did you really devise these 4?
Well, we should give credit to a gentleman by the name of Dean Oliver, who I blatantly stole these ideas from. He actually wrote a book, I guess around 2002, called Basketball on Paper, and that was actually a really big inspiration for what I'm doing. But the trick was, Dean was really an NBA guy. He was focused on NBA work. He's actually currently on the Washington Wizards coaching staff. So I took those from him, and basically, the idea is, those 4 things basically explain everything about your offense or your defense. Those are the kind of the 4 like main components of what you do. So they're kind of, these kind of naturally work in that way. And I guess the one key thing to remember about those things, which I alluded to earlier, but there's basically no team in the country that's going to be good at all of those things. Some teams are really, really good at like 2 things, and that's good enough to like drive a good offense or a good defense. And some are, okay, like 4 things, and they're going to be pretty good. But, you can really see like different styles in terms of what teams specialize in terms of each of the 4 factors on offense and defense.
In the miscellaneous category, I really find the non-steal turnover percentage as a real interesting stat that you keep a track of. In fact, UTEP, they would reference that all the time because they loved getting people on shot clock violations last year defensively. Can you explain that stat a little bit to our listeners?
Right. So like all turnovers are either steals or there's something other than a steal. And you can think of, you mentioned one, obviously shot clock violations. Charges are a big thing as well. Defensive fouls drawn tends to correlate pretty closely with that. Traveling violations, things like that. So It's really kind of the other things that are maybe not exciting turnovers, not the type of turnovers that necessarily lead like a fast break the other way, but indicate certainly a certain style of a team's defense. And you certainly can separate the teams from, specializing getting a lot of those to teams that maybe play a more passive defense, let's say, and don't, get a lot of those.
Continuing our conversation right now with Ken Pomeroy. You can go online to kenpom.com, check everything out. There's subscriptions available. You get all the information you need. And essentially what this does is kind of like we've talked about with Jay Jaffe at Fangraphs and footballoutsiders.com. So much is in the analytics movement in sports. Ken's been doing it for 20 years, 20 plus, but now it's just a way to really understand college basketball a little differently. The WAC thinks highly enough of Ken's ratings to incorporate it in seedings for their tournament. And that's one of the big reasons we want to bring Ken Pomeroy on with us and talk about everything he's got up on his site. I love the fact that you not only have team analysis, but then you also go in depth into individual players as well. And this is interesting because what you'll do is look at certain categories and compare players versus the national rankings, which I guess from a scouting standpoint really gives teams that subscribe to your, your site a little better understanding about each player and their value and their worth.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I guess the main benefit to me is looking at players, especially who maybe play reserve roles. If you look at per game averages, obviously, you know who the star players are on the team and things like that, and who the good rebounders are. But, really looking at what players do when they get the opportunity to play, in terms of like rebounding rates and assist rates and things like that, their overall efficiency, when they take a shot or do something on the court. Those things are, to me, pretty useful, especially, like I said, for those part-time guys. When you look at their per game averages, you're not going to get a lot of great information out of it.
Well, I love the fact you've got them broken down into major contributors, significant contributors, role players, limited roles, and then nearly invisible. And it's based on percentage of possessions used. So the greater your possessions used is, then the greater your role is going to be. And it's interesting in the sense that every player is in a specific category based on those possessions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everybody on your favorite team, they all have a certain role offensively, and some have a big role and some have a small role. Some have a small role and perform extremely efficiently in that role. And if they had a larger role, they might not do as well. And, especially the star players use a lot of possessions. I think, they're pretty interesting because, you can get to a guy who's a pretty high scorer and he can do that by maybe not shooting that well, but taking a ton of shots, or he can get there by, not taking a ton of shots, but shooting really well. And so that kind of information is also on the page there. And I think really useful in kind of scouting an upcoming opponent.
I know how much the WAC thinks of you. That's obvious by now. What about just the rest of college basketball? Are you finding that more and more teams are using what you've been able to build all these years and incorporate that into their scouting before games?
Yeah, I think, every team probably uses it in some way, or every team's a subscriber, but maybe 200 use it regularly, and maybe 100 really know what they're doing with it and get an advantage. But there's no question, teams are, they understand the use of analytics at this point. There's somebody on every coaching staff that understands that. And especially as we get more turnover in coaching staffs, we're getting more people now on staffs that basically grew up with my work, which is kind of a scary thing. But, it's all they've known in their coaching career is going onto my website or using, other websites like Synergy. But certainly they're it's just second nature for them to incorporate this work into their scouts.
Ken, how has your analytics evolved over the years? What would you say is the biggest change now versus what we might have seen maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago?
Well, the analytics hasn't changed a whole lot. I've, added little things here and there on the site, and we've gotten, I think more data over the years, especially in terms of play-by-play data. So we can derive things like possession length on offense and defense. For a while, all we had was, possessions per game when I first started, and a team could play a slow tempo because they're just really good defensively at slowing teams down, or they could play a slow tempo because they hold the ball offensively. Now we can know and we can differentiate between offense and defensive possession length. I have some stuff on there about fouling, how the coaches handle foul trouble, which is something that, we couldn't have done without play-by-play data. So that's, I think, very interesting as well. You can kind of know immediately if you're watching a game, if a player gets 2 fouls early in the first half, you can look at my site and see how see how the team handles players with 2 fouls and pretty quickly understand if you're ever going to see that player again in the first half or not.
Interesting. What about in terms of just using it to try to predict outcomes of games? I know it seems like it's crazy, but nowadays how we're seeing daily, whether it's DraftKings and a lot of these daily sites come around and how big sports gambling is, has that become part of this whole equation?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I started, actually, that was also motivation. It was not necessarily gambling, but was, the point spreads are really, really good and really accurate. And but when I started, you only, and even now, I guess you really only have point spreads for a day in advance. So I kind of wanted to have something where I could see point spreads for 2 weeks in advance or something, an upcoming game that I was looking forward to. And so, I think the predictions, are pretty good in that sense. And I'm sure there's quite a few people that subscribe to my site that use the information to try to help them in their own gambling interests, I'm sure.
Now going back to the WAC tournament model, specifically with New Mexico State, they're headed to Conference USA as early as, next year. So how do you think the model is going to change when when there's a lot more parity in the conference?
Yeah, I mean, the model itself, we'll just have to see how things go this year. I don't anticipate changes, but, we'll get feedback from the teams and we'll see what happens. But, yeah, I mean, I think the parity aspect just makes things more exciting. One of the things that people really haven't talked about with this system is that it makes non-conference games meaningful. Obviously, if you're a team maybe chasing an at-large berth, like non-conference games are somewhat meaningful, but let's face it, most teams in the WAC are not in that boat. So it makes those non-conference games meaningful. You win a big non-conference game and it's not just like a win for you. It's like, it's actually going to help you in your conference seeding. And so certainly at the top of the conference, if there's more parity there, like it's just going to make those non-conference games more interesting for all the league's members.
This season with the WAC is a great litmus test, I'm sure, for you, because if it goes well and people really like the way the WAC handles their tournament and the way things go, others could follow. And before you know it, you might become kind of the norm when it comes to teams looking to find a way to seed their members a little different than just conference standings.
Yeah, I think it's potentially an exciting way to do things for one bid league. Certainly, you want to generate a little bit more interest and excitement in what's going on in your league. Like I said, you can do this kind of system puts emphasis on games year round. It doesn't necessarily, the conference season is still important. It's still 2/3 of your schedule and it still matters, but it just adds a little more interest to the non-conference schedule as well. And so I think, you're probably not going to see the SEC or the Big 12 go to something like this, but certainly, conferences outside of the Power Five or outside of the multi-bid leagues, the top 10 leagues, I think it is something that could be pretty useful for them going forward.
So this next question is for Ken Pomeroy, the college basketball fan, not KenPom.com, the analytics college basketball wizard. As a fan, does the current state of athletics in college, especially with NIL and the way it's now changing the game, I don't want to say, does it change the way you look at the sport, but in your mind, is it something that's going to maybe hurt college basketball more than help it here, at least in the short term before the NCAA figures out how they can regulate this?
I'm not too concerned about it. Obviously, there's some things that, could stand to be regulated at this point. But, we were always headed to something like this at some point. It was, I think, mainly the NCAA's mismanagement that led to kind of the Wild West here for the last couple of seasons. But I'm definitely strongly pro player in terms of allowing them to be rewarded for their talents and things like that. So to me, yeah, it's change. And I mean, change is tough, but, I think 10 years from now, the sport will be in a better place. And I think from a fan standpoint, it's still just exciting as it ever was. I know there's a lot more player movement and that turns some people off, but I don't know, man. I look back at last year's tournament. It was really fun, and obviously the Carolina Duke game was one of the highest rated college basketball games of the last few years in the Final Four, and so I'm looking forward to the sport being pretty healthy going forward, and I still love it as much as I did 20 years ago.
What is your favorite analytical metric from your site?
Well, the easiest one, I know people get scared off by stats, but the easiest one I feel like to implement and use and that anybody can understand is 2-point percentage. And we don't really talk about that. When they implemented the 3-point shot, we kept field goal percentage and we used 3-point percentage. And obviously there's overlap in both of those things. And so one of the things I do on my site, whether it's the team breakdowns or the player breakdowns, is break things down by 2-point percentage and 3-point percentage. So you can see, our team's good inside the arc or they get outside the arc. And try to get people away from just thinking in terms of like bulk field goal percentage, which combines, really difficult shots, 3-point shots, and easier shots, 2-point shots. And it doesn't necessarily give you a very meaningful number.
Now, you mentioned your site hasn't changed all that much over the years. Could we see some big changes possibly in years to come as you look in the future of where this is headed in college basketball? Give me a little bit of an idea, if you had to go into your crystal ball, where you think we could see the future of where Ken Pom goes.
Yeah, it really depends on the data that I have access to. Like I mentioned the play-by-play data earlier, but that actually has like really been upgraded here in the last couple of years in terms of getting shot location and things like that. So, things like shot charts for players and things related to that for teams as well is something that I'd love to work on. I'm really torn though, because, I'm dealing with coaches who, have their routine and don't necessarily like change and are very familiar with the format of my website, which has mostly remained the same for, the last 10 years at least. So I'm pretty careful about making like kind of major changes because I know that I'll get some pushback from my core users who are my best advertisers, that being coaches and media.
You want to check it out, it's kenpom.com, folks. You can subscribe and get all the information that all the teams get as well, kenpom.com. Really enjoyed the conversation, Ken. Have a great rest of your summer, and let's keep in touch and look forward to seeing how the WAC deals with everything this upcoming season.
Sounds great, guys. Thanks for having me on.